Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 203. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about the world's tallest building, indoor ski slopes, and ancient souks as we go to the Persian Gulf states.
One more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one is a very cool promotion that's being done by Disney, and it's being done starting in January of 2010. When you sign up to volunteer for a day of service with a participating organization, you get a free day of admission to Walt Disney World or Disneyland. So check that out. The second news story is not a good idea, and that was when the crew, the pilots, and the flight attendants of an Air India flight started fighting, fisticuffs kind of fighting, at 30,000 feet. According to the article, endangering the lives of 106 passengers and grossly violating safety norms. Now, Air India later on said that there was nobody ever at risk, but not a good idea. And then in the news of the weird story, the Chinese media have reported with great certainty that there is an enclave in the northern woods of Sweden that has 25,000 women who are lesbians. And according to the news agency, the all-female enclave is called Chakopal City and was founded in 1820 by a wealthy widow. It's surrounded by two blonde sentries who prevent men from entering, and those chaps who do unwisely attempt to force the issue risk being beaten half to death by the Nordic gender police. A spokesperson for the Swedish Association of Local Authorities thought that that was a doubtful story. For links to all three of those news stories and others, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Gary Arndt, who's come to talk to us about the Persian Gulf states. Gary, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
And for those of you who don't know, Gary and I now do a weekly podcast, so I get to do this weekly with Gary on early Wednesday mornings as we do This Week in Travel. And Gary, you traveled around the world, or have been traveling around the world for something like 2.5 years, as I recall.
Yeah, I'm still doing it. I'm 2.5 years into the trip, and in fact, I'm talking to you from Victoria, British Columbia.
Okay. And when you first came on the show, which was something like 1.5 years ago to talk about Micronesia, you weren't actually quite as far into the trip. You were relatively early on.
I was in Melbourne at the time. I was actually there for a month.
Is that where you were? I couldn't remember.
Yeah, I was waiting to get a new passport, and that's probably a pretty good city to have to wait in. It was beautiful weather. It was in February, so yeah, I enjoyed it.
So the Persian Gulf states, when we say the Persian Gulf states, you went to 5 different ones, as I recall, and I'm not going to try and do them from memory.
I arrived in the United Arab Emirates. I flew from Bangkok into Abu Dhabi, and then I went to Dubai. And the United Arab Emirates are really a unique political institution in the world. They're a confederation of monarchies. So it is a country as it's represented by the United Nations, but it's a very federated country. So the national government does treaties and things like that. But within the country, there are 7 different emirates, and they all kind of do their own thing. And the 2 big emirates, like 80% of the country is Abu Dhabi by land. Then I think like 12% is Dubai, and then the rest are the other 5 little tiny emirates.
And do you remember the other little tiny emirates off the top of your head, or?
No, I can't. I drove through them all, believe it or not, on the course of my travels, but you would drive through them and it would just be like driving through a city. But I literally just passed through them.
Okay. And what was noticeable about United Arab Emirates?
When you arrived in Dubai, I was very excited to go to Dubai because you hear all this stuff about all the construction and the biggest building in the world and the indoor ski slope and all this junk they're building. So I was really excited to go there and see this stuff.
The first refrigerated beach is the one that I remember.
Yeah, I mean, all this crazy stuff is going on. And the thing that struck me is I didn't meet any Arabs. Everyone you meet, like everyone you deal with on a day-to-day basis at hotels and restaurants and stores, are either Filipino or they're from South Asia. India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, everybody. And I think I read a stat that it's like 80 to 90% of the population in the United Arab Emirates, of the residents, are non-Arab. Only 10% of the people that actually live there are Emirati. A couple times I'd walk down the street and I would see guys playing cricket. If you didn't know any better, you'd swear you were in southern India.
Interesting. I guess I wouldn't have expected that either. So it's basically an oligarchy then, except that this still has the monarchy.
Well, the way it was kind of explained to me and the way I observed it is that there's kind of a pecking order. At the very top are the Emirati. So the royal family, they own everything. And other Emiratis will have government positions, high managerial positions, anything in the government, things like that. And they own most of the big businesses. So like Emirate Airlines and very other things. They have several seaports, the Jebel Ali port. They run that. High-end managers usually come from the United States or Europe. High-end white-collar employees are usually Indian or Pakistani. Retail workers, service workers, anything that involves interaction with people are usually Filipino. And then at the very bottom are the manual laborers, the men who do all the construction, and they tend to be South Asian. So India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh.
Interesting. And did you see, we were there obviously a short time, any tensions that were caused by that interesting mix of people?
No, not at all, actually. It runs rather well. Any place you go in the Gulf, I mean, you have to understand, it's not a democracy.
Sure.
They still have monarchies everywhere. The monarchies, to varying degrees in the different countries, are pretty absolute. But there isn't a lot of ethnic tension. There are some problems in Dubai. You've probably read about. There's a lot of debt and issues with the economy. There are issues with people abandoning cars that you'll read about, or houses, because they can't afford the debt. They just abandon them at the airport and leave. There are issues with, and this is really one of the biggest problems, people come from India, they get the construction jobs, and they don't make a lot of money. And they understand that. They're going to make maybe $5 a day. But the room and board are paid for, so all the money can get sent back to home.
Okay.
But they give their passport to their employer. Well, the economy goes down, and the employers aren't giving them their passport back, and they're not paying them. And these guys are basically kind of stuck there. And so it's a type of indentured servitude. And when you bring it up to the government, they just say, well, if they're doing that, they're not supposed to be doing that. So...
Yeah, I saw that the big project they were doing with one of the islands in the shape of the world or whatever was canceled because I think the funding basically fell through just recently.
Yeah, they have one that is mostly done called the Palm Jeremiah, and it's like a big shape of a palm. You can see it on Google Earth if you look at it.
Right.
And it's basically just a big subdivision, like you'd see in new housing construction. And I have heard that they're having some problems because they didn't let the soil settle enough before they built it.
Oh, my.
Yeah. And they have, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Atlantis Resort that's in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another Atlantis that was built on the Palm Jeremiah property, and it looks almost identical to it.
And what did you do? What did you focus on when you were in Dubai? Let's start with that.
I focused on not a whole lot. I mean, well, That, like I said, I went there wanting to see all this new stuff, right? This is one of the newest cities in the world.
Right.
Literally, most of this stuff was not there 10 years ago. It was just desert. And it's malls and it's buildings and hotels. And the only part of Dubai that I really felt was kind of old school, historical Dubai, is the area near what's called the Creek. That is where historically Dubai was founded. It was a trading port. There's an inlet that goes into the desert a little bit, and you had pearl divers and other trading things that go on. So if you go there today, you will still see the gold souk. You'll see more traditional things, and that's where you actually will see Arab merchants and things like that. But that's just this one kind of old part of town, and the everything else, which is kind of everything Dubai is today, is all this new stuff.
Okay.
It's just malls and high-end brands usually.
Sure, yeah. No, it's definitely catering to the wealthy. It's definitely what they're trying to attract there.
Yeah, I found it very expensive. The absolute cheapest I could find a hotel room for was $100 a night.
Okay, well, that's not too bad, but compared to where you were coming from, I imagine that was highway robbery, but...
Well, it's bad insofar as that's the bottom end.
Sure.
Right? So even in Europe, you could occasionally find a $60 to $75 a night hotel room, and certainly much more than Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think that when the Burj Dubai is finished, that's the tallest building in the world,
Right.
which I have to admit is really impressive. I don't know if you've ever seen the designs for Frank Lloyd Wright had designed like a mile-high tower.
Right. Mm-hmm.
This is almost that. I mean, it is so big, it is stupid big. You know, there are different categories. In my trip, I got to see Taipei 101,
Right.
the Petronas Towers.
Mhm.
I've been to the Sears Tower. And they always have Petronas Tower is bigger than the Sears Tower, but only because of the spire, but actually the top floor of the Sears Tower is bigger. And they have all these different categorizations, and they
Right.
bicker about what's the tallest building. And the CN Tower in Toronto is bigger than that, but it's not really a building, it's a structure. And then there's a TV antenna in North Dakota that's bigger than this. This is just the biggest anything ever. You just, by any category, the Burj Dubai is the biggest, the end. And
Right.
it's ridiculously big. And they had to create a bunch of techniques for pumping cement, I guess, because it's so hot and it's so tall.
My uncle has done some construction in the outback in Australia doing dams and such, and they had to be careful not even just to handle the tools because they were so hot, the metal tools, but also you'd have to actually cool the aggregate, the gravel, before you poured in the cement. Otherwise it would dry much too fast and it would be very unstable.
Yeah, I should mention, I was there in July, and it was rather cool. It was much colder than I thought it would be. You have this impression of Arabia being very, very hot, which it is, but that time of year it's not. It would be about in the 50s Fahrenheit.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not my picture. Except at night, I would expect it to get cooler. But anything else in Dubai before we move on?
If you're going to the region, I know a lot of people may go to do business in Dubai. One, I was very disappointed by the quality of their bandwidth and their internet connectivity.
Okay.
Well, no, if you look at a map of the world,
Mhm.
well, I know we've talked about this in This Week in Travel, but even though they're physically kind of close to Europe,
Right.
any cable has to run around Africa to do it. Or likewise, it's a long trip to get to Asia. And then they filter a lot of things. So, for example, Flickr was blocked. I couldn't upload images to Flickr.
Any other tips on Dubai?
Go see the malls, get that out of your system, and definitely go to the creek area and the spice souks and the gold souks.
Your next stop was where?
Oman,
Oman.
which was really a pleasant surprise. I was not intending to go to Oman, but some people on my website recommended it to me. There's a bus that goes from Dubai to Muscat, so I took the bus. Oman was a very pleasant experience. I thought it was by far the nicest place to visit in the Gulf region. It is not nearly as developed as Dubai, not even close. It is a very clean country. They have laws on the books that require you to wash your car, and you also have to paint your house every so often.
Okay, I'd be in trouble with the car washing one, but...
It's a very tidy place. The roads are in excellent condition. They do make money off of oil, but they're not as much an oil powerhouse as some of the other countries in the region. They haven't developed business to the extent that like Dubai has, so there isn't like massive ports or things like that. Oman traditionally has been a trading country.
Right.
They used to own Zanzibar, and they also used to own, I want to say it's Baluchistan in Pakistan.
Oh, okay, I did not know that.
Those were like two trading outposts that Oman used to control. When I arrived in Muscat, it was the finals of the Gulf Cup Championship in soccer, and Oman beat Saudi Arabia, and everyone was going nuts. And I didn't know what was going on because everyone had banners and the Omani flag was waving. And I went to bed, and then I got woken up several times by people shouting and cars honking in the middle of the night. And this is the first time they had won this in, I think, like 10 years. So everybody was going crazy. Muscat, it's a clean city. The Mutra Souk, which is near the waterfront area, very nice. They have the best-looking currency I've ever seen in the world. The one Omani Rial note is just beautiful. I mean, it's a work of art. In addition to Muscat, I also took a trip inland. 90 kilometers is a city called Nizwa. And one of the things you'll notice in Oman is that there are all kinds of forts, small, like a rook on a chessboard. These real small forts that are embedded into the mountains. You'll see them in Muscat all over, and you'll see them also in Nizwa. One of the things I did is rented a car in Nizwa. I drove around for the day, and I drove the mountain range in Oman is the Hajar Mountains. Very beautiful. It's kind of a high desert, much different than what you would see, say, in the UAE, where it's just kind of sand dunes and kind of scrubby. There are several World Heritage sites in the area that I was not able to go to, even though I looked for them, because they have absolutely no signage and there's absolutely no industry built around tourism for these places.
Interesting.
But driving was very easy. All of the signs are in English. There's many people who speak English, so that wasn't a problem at all. And Oman is also known as the place where frankincense is also traditionally made.
Okay.
That's one thing I purchased when I was there at the souk was some frankincense and myrrh.
And frankincense is a resin, as I recall, from a sap from a tree. Do I have that right?
Yep.
Okay.
It's a resin, and if you've ever gone to, I know it's used in Catholic religious ceremonies. I think it's also used in Orthodox, but that's primarily what's used for incense.
Okay. And you said these old forts shaped like rooks. Is this left over from the Ottoman Empire, or do they predate that, or what are those from? Do you know?
They definitely predate it. I went to the Bahala Fort, which is just outside of Nizwa, and that's several hundred years old. So this goes back to the time where I think there were different clans and warlords and whatnot.
Interesting. And after Oman, you went to...
What I did from Muscat is I took the world's fastest ferry from Muscat. If you look at a map of Oman, and this is probably a really good thing to put in the enhanced iPod edition if you're looking at it right now, there's kind of this chunk, the corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's primarily most of Oman. And then there's this little exclave, which is at the very tip into the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay.
That's called the Musandam Peninsula. So I took a ferry ride. It's the world's fastest ferry from Muscat to Kasab in the Musandam Peninsula.
This is a hydrofoil then?
Yes. And what's really interesting about it is that the government was so keen on having the world's fastest ferry that they forgot to ever build a facility for people to drive cars on the ferry. So it had been in service over a year. It's never had a car. It burns 18,000 liters of fuel per trip.
Oh, my.
And the cost is the same as flying, except this took 3 or 4 hours, I think, and a flight takes 45 minutes. Have you ever been on a ferry and they have a snack bar?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so they have a snack bar, and I go up and I say, oh, can I have a Diet Coke and a candy bar? And they said, sure, and they give it to me. And I said, how much is it? And they said, it's free. And I'm like, this is not the way to run a business. If you're not going to have cars, if you're going to waste all this fuel, don't give away the food. But so I was like, okay, give me 3 candy bars, and I put them in my bag, and that was that. The Musandam Peninsula is really beautiful, and very few people go there. There's only one town, Musandam. But if you look at a map very closely, like going to Google Earth, that tip is actually a series of fjords. And it's like a hydra head almost. All of these snaking mountains going all over. So we took a mountain safari. We went up in a Jeep, and we were able to see some very old settlements that people lived in, where there were literally piles of rocks built on a mountainside. And some people still live like that, but they still have those sort of shelters near their home or ancestral type dwellings. But you could go up to the mountaintop and look down onto the sea, and to get there by boat would have taken, I think they said, 7 hours, just because of the snake-like pattern of going through all the fjords.
Interesting. Fjords in the Arabian Peninsula, it doesn't quite fit for me.
Well, if you look at it on a map, it'll make perfect sense.
Sure.
It's just that you lose the resolution of it when you just look at a big map, but that's what it's like. I drove back from Kasab to Dubai. They don't have regular buses, but they have like 8-passenger vans that do the trip. If you're in Dubai, you could actually take the trip up to Musandam and spend a couple days there, which it would be another thing I would really recommend doing if you're going to Dubai. From there, I went to Qatar.
Which is the one I have never know how to pronounce.
Yeah, like welcome back, Qatar. I remember like during the first Gulf War, it was Qatar and Qatar. And I think the regional dialect does pronounce the first syllable as like a G. So it's actually Qatar or closer to that, or gutter. But Qatar is what they say on the commercials for Qatar Airlines. So that's what I'm going with.
Okay.
And I got to say, it on paper, it's supposed to be one of the richest countries in the world. This is where Al Jazeera is from. And I got to meet some people from Al Jazeera when I was there. Other than that, I really didn't think there was a whole lot to see or do in the country. It's a very flat, dry, arid, small peninsula. Doha is the capital, and really that's pretty much where everything is. There's a very interesting souk and market area near the shore, but as within the other countries in the Gulf, there's a lot of Filipinos and South Asians that you'll find working pretty much everywhere. Not as much as Dubai, but still significant.
Now, Al Jazeera obviously has a more questionable reputation in the West and in the United States in particular, but what is different about Qatar that it's able to have what is basically free press in all these other countries around here less so?
I was in there in January, so this was just after Israel had done a lot of their strikes into the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
Al Jazeera Arab is totally different than Al Jazeera English.
Sure.
Al Jazeera English, I actually think, is a pretty good station. Al Jazeera Arabic is basically the Fox News of the Arab world. It is very biased. But I will say this as well, to their benefit. I was watching what was happening in Gaza at the time, and the BBC would park themselves out of Gaza and say, this is as close as we can get because we can't get inside. And this is what they would do every day. And you could turn on Al Jazeera Arabic, and they had people in Gaza Strip providing footage. So certainly, one, it was possible to get in, and two, BBC could have probably just the rights to the footage from Al Jazeera, but they didn't. So I don't think it's so much free speech.
Well, freer is, I think, my understanding of Al Jazeera, in the sense that it's not a state-controlled...
Well, it is state-controlled.
Oh, is it state-controlled? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. It's owned and operated by the royal family in Qatar. So that's why there's such a huge difference between the Arabic and the English language version. I think they put on a very different face for their audience.
Interesting. So not much to see in Qatar. And from there you went to?
Bahrain, which is very close. It's a very short trip. In fact, they just announced they're going to be building a bridge. It's going to be the longest bridge in the world, like a 40-kilometer bridge between Qatar and Bahrain. You can go there by land. It's a short trip, but you have to go through Saudi Arabia to do it. And if you do that, you have to get a visa, and it's a real pain to do it, even if you want to get like a transit visa. It's very, very difficult. So I didn't go to Saudi Arabia, and that's probably, worth another show, but it's much more difficult to do that. Bahrain has the reputation of being the Las Vegas of the Gulf. But in reality, because it's the Gulf, it's more like the Branson, Missouri of the Gulf.
Okay.
So in other words, if you're Saudi, you go there and you can drink beer. They have belly dancing shows. I walked past this one place. There were several restaurants in the building. I walked past and I heard some Arab music coming from, and I poked my head in. There were some Arab men in there, and I wouldn't call it a strip club or anything like that, but they were drinking alcohol and girls were dancing. So that was their good time. And I think that there's been reports that they're going to try to crack down on that because they don't like the reputation they have. But that's kind of what it is. And like the other places, you'll see a lot of Filipinos, a fair number of Indians that have lived there for a very long time. The only real attraction in Bahrain is they have a place called the Tree of Life. Like I said, the country's not very big. I mean, literally, you could get from one end to the other in easily under an hour, maybe a half hour. And it's just this lone tree on the top of a hill that has no other trees around it. That is probably the biggest tourist attraction in the country.
And you say it's the Tree of Life. Is there religious?
No, it's not religious at all.
It's just like the Lone Cypress here in Carmel.
Yeah, it's just like that.
Okay.
I should add, when I say it's the only thing to see, that's incorrect. Fort Bahrain is actually very interesting. It's a World Heritage Site. Bahrain used to be the location of the Portuguese were there, and so there's an old Portuguese fort there. But then the Portuguese fort was built on an even earlier settlement where this was the hub of kind of a trading empire hundreds of years ago. So it's kind of held its status as that. It's not a big oil producer. They do produce a little bit of oil, but not very much. Their economics relies mostly on banking and kind of being an offshore center for Saudis and other people in the region.
Okay.
One interesting thing I did note in Bahrain, most of the countries in the Gulf region are Sunni Islam, but most of Bahrain is actually Shiite.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so you saw pictures for, I think it was Grand Ayatollah Sistani in some of the villages and whatnot that I saw in the region.
Okay.
The royal family, however, is Sunni.
And then your last stop was Kuwait.
Was Kuwait. And what was interesting, the day I left Bahrain and the day I arrived at Kuwait, there was a big sandstorm, which is a very interesting thing if you've never been in one. I know there's been some pictures in the news the last couple of days about Sydney getting hit with a sandstorm, all the dust coming in. But yeah, it really gives the sky and everything a very strange color. Kuwait has a very big Western presence, as you can guess, from military contractors and whatnot, of everything going on in the region. It's probably the most liberal country that I visited in the Gulf. There's not a whole lot to see in the area around Kuwait City. If you go to the Kuwait Towers, there are 3 towers. They kind of look like pinnacles with balls in the middle. One is an observation deck, one is a water tower, and the other is actually, I think, like an FM transmitter. That's kind of the iconic thing in the city.
Okay.
That was basically trashed when the Iraqis invaded. And so you'll find different things talking about that. There's a museum that talks about the Iraqi invasion, and it's obviously very partisan.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know what the other side of that would be. They were invaded. The Iraqis trashed the place. But it's also very much, I would occasionally see Arab women not wearing a hijab.
Okay.
I would occasionally see men not wearing a kaifa and their traditional clothing. They do have a type of parliament. I wouldn't call it a full-blown democracy, but it's certainly more democratic than any other place in the Gulf. This was even true before the first Gulf War. You go around, it has the look and feel of an American suburb in a place like Arizona. There's been a lot of rebuilding in the last 20 years since the war. So you'll see a lot of American chain restaurants, malls, things like that. In addition to McDonald's, you see like Trader Vic's.
Interesting.
But without alcohol.
Sure. That's an odd change for Trader Vic's. But as you look at the region, what's the place you would go back to?
Oman.
Interesting. Okay.
In a heartbeat. Most of the other places, I really felt like if you're American, it's just like going to America. It's developed. It's got malls and the chain stores and everything else. If you really want to get a sense of what Arabia is like, I think you're going to see it most in Oman.
Okay.
And people told me it's even more so in Yemen, but I didn't get to Yemen.
Okay. And Yemen has been a little less stable than the Gulf region. I don't know if that's an issue these days or not, but...
Yeah, I should also add, every place I went, people are like, oh, the Middle East, terrorism. There's never been any terrorism in any of these places that I know of. There has never been any Omani terrorists from Dubai, any of these places. All the people there are rather well off, rather high standards of living. The one thing I do not worry about in any of these countries is safety.
Best food?
The food is very similar throughout the region. What we call these countries today were really just a mix of different sultanates and emirates and whatnot that had different British protection. And then when they decolonized, they had to actually make nation states out of them. They're all just generally Arab, so they eat kind of Arab food. And so you can find shawarma and hummus, things like that pretty much everywhere.
Okay.
Just standard Arab food.
And the best day you had there?
Best day was probably when I went to Musandam and I took the trek up into the mountains.
Okay. Yeah.
Very beautiful, very surprising.
And you're a great photographer. I've enjoyed your pictures. Your favorite picture from the region?
It would probably have to be a sunset photo up in the Hajar Mountains in Musandam. I also have a couple that I took on the boat in the Strait of Hormuz, which were kind of interesting of sunset.
Okay. And this is the lightning round here. So the most memorable person you met?
I listen to this show religiously every week, and I knew you were going to ask that question, and I have a great answer for you. I was going from Nizwa back to Muscat, and I had my backpack on, and I was told to go to this taxi stand that was maybe a mile or two away. So I began walking, and a man pulled up in his car, and he did not speak any English, and I did not speak any Arabic. Through gesturing and whatnot, he was going to offer to take me to the taxi stand. So, you know, you're a little bit leery as a traveler when people offer these things,
Sure.
but I get in the car, and he takes me there. Again, we kind of communicate through gestures and whatnot. I explain I'm going to Muscat. This is what this man did. And mind you, we are not speaking the same language. He drove me all the way to Muscat. It's about an hour and a half drive. He bought me lunch. We took a detour because he wanted to stop someplace that had really good kebabs on the side of the road. He bought me those, takes me to the doorstep of the hotel I'm staying at, and refuses to take any money for gasoline whatsoever, says goodbye, and leaves. And I always bring this up to people because it's like, oh, they hate Americans. And it's like, these people, hospitality is a really big deal in this region.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I was in Jordan. I mean, hospitality is legendary. But we shouldn't confuse that with, they're not necessarily an outgoing people. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you're walking on the street, they won't go say, hey, how are you doing? And come and hug you and things like that. However, if they see you're in need or they can help you or they can do something for you, they'll give you the shirt off their back. And he stood out as one of the most memorable people of all of my travels.
Wow, that's saying a lot. Okay.
Just because it was, I mean, what he did was so unnecessary and uncalled for, and yet he did it anyhow without any compensation or anything. It was just a nice gesture on his part.
Excellent. Now, I'm assuming you're not hauling a lot of tour books around with you in your backpack here, so you're using the internet primarily for planning purposes?
I use the internet. I talk to my website readers and, just people I meet in traveling. And
you mentioned your website a couple times. We should give people the URL. Gary is, as far as we know, probably the most popular travel blogger right now in terms of somebody who's talking about their personal travels. And your URL is...
As far as I know, it's everything-everywhere.com.
Okay. And then the last two questions that I've got here. Oh, actually, before we get there, one thing you should know and one thing you should pack before going to this region.
One thing you should know. The one thing you should know is that you're not necessarily going to be meeting a lot of Arabs.
Right. Okay.
That many of the people you'll be dealing with as a tourist going to stores and hotels will actually be people from India and the Philippines. Like I said, that took me by surprise. I was not aware of just how pronounced that was going to be. You have to go to other countries. If you go to, say, Jordan, non-oil producing states, you can meet people who are Arab all the time. Mm-hmm. And then that, I think, is probably less pronounced in Oman, even though you will see foreigners working there as well.
Okay. One thing you should pack.
Long pants.
Oh, okay. All right.
When I was there, like I said, it was colder than I expected, so wearing long pants was necessary. But also, you hear every so often about someone who does something outrageous in Dubai on a beach.
Right.
Public displays of affection, and that I'm putting that very gently. You should, when you're in a Muslim country, dress conservatively. Mm-hmm. You don't need to dress like they do. They don't expect it. But certainly wear long pants, wear a shirt with sleeves. Short sleeves are fine. Sandals are actually acceptable. Sandals are worn by most men in the region that I saw, so that's fine. You don't necessarily have to wear shoes, but definitely don't walk around in shorts. I don't really think you want to. Either it's going to be too cold for shorts or too hot for shorts. You're going to want to actually cover yourself.
Okay. And then as we go to wind this down, you really know you're in the Gulf states when what?
When you look at the currency and you say, wow, this is really good looking. Everywhere I went in the Gulf, they had just beautiful currency. It's the dirham is in the UAE, it's the rial in Oman, and Kuwait has the dinar, and then Qatar has, I think they have the dinar as well, and then maybe it's like Bahrain has the rial. But anyways, they're all really good looking.
If you had to describe the Gulf states, all five, all different kind of places, in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Modern, traditional, and desert.
Okay.
It's the biggest mix of modern. All the buildings and everything else are very modern, but there's still a very traditional way which people live. Mm-hmm.
Well, Gary, thanks for coming back on the show. I'll see you again on Wednesday, or talk to you again on Wednesday when we do the next This Week in Travel. But thanks for coming back on the Amateur Traveler.
Thank you very much.
I have one internet resource for you today, and that is Heather Copper from Heather on Her Travels sent me an email that she has started a podcast. I haven't listened to the first episode yet. I'm sure it's terrific. It's on family travel with the Hospitality Club, which you may remember that she mentioned on the show that she was on, which is the amateur travel show about going to Valencia in Spain. So check that out at heatheronhertravels.com. In news from the community, I have a couple announcements that I wanted to talk about. One is that there is a survey up, and you can find this at the Amateur Traveler fan page on Facebook. That's facebook.com/amateurtraveler. And you'll find a link to a survey about potential amateur traveler trips. And some people have already taken the survey. Right now, national parks seem to be a popular destination that people are thinking about. Also, the second announcement, there's going to be a meetup. It's this week, so if you're just listening to the show after the 15th of October, I'm afraid you missed it, and you might want to follow me on the fan page at Facebook, or you might want to follow me on Twitter so you can get more timely announcements, and apologies if you've missed that. But we're going to do a meetup around the Blog World Expo in Las Vegas, and I'm doing that with our guest today, Gary Arndt, who blogs, as we said, at everythingeverywhere.com and also does This Week in Travel with me. And then I am contemplating a major change in the show. You may or may not know that a lot of the downloads for the Amateur Traveler are from the archives. They're not from the latest show, but from the older shows. And that's terrific. One of the problems I've got, though, is that the two versions of the show, the MP3 version of the show and then the enhanced version of the show, I can't insert ads in the enhanced version of the show. And I kept hoping for the last 4 years that the technology would change and I'd be able to do that. That doesn't look like that's going to happen. It doesn't look like the technology is going to change. So I'm trying to monetize those, and I'm looking at doing a change in the show where to get the older versions of the show that is enhanced, and when I say older, not the last month's worth, the last 4 shows or so, but older than that, you'd have to be a premium member of the show, and probably something like $15 a year. I'm thinking that premium members would also get first shot at any trips that we would do. And let me know what you think about that. I know that I have tried not to charge anything for the show, and I still wanted to make the show always available for free, and I'm planning on doing both versions available for free, but the enhanced version only available for the last 4 shows for free. Give me your opinions if you can think of a better way for me to pay for some of the work that it takes to do that show, which is a much more labor-intensive show. I'm going to skip the letters from the community this time because of the other news, and I'm trying to get this show out so I can go to Blog World tomorrow. So again, if you have questions, feel free to leave me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also post a comment on this or any episode at amateurtraveler.com. Again, check out the Facebook fan page, facebook.com/amateurtraveler, or check me out on Twitter at either Chris2X, which is all my Twitter news, or Amateur Traveler, which is just the news about the show. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in